thank you all for coming, and I hope you are doing well. A few announcements. Our next meeting will be on Sunday, September 13th, where Steve Herman will present his talk entitled Vocation Dreams. So a year ago, Shirley Kaiser told me that Karen Naifeh had just published an article in the Young Journal of Culture and Psyche entitled Encountering the Other, the White Shadow. She told me that Karen would be a great speaker for the APC if we could get her. And then when I read the article, I thought it was a very powerful piece that showed what a Jungian perspective had to offer on a critical social issue of racism. Little did I know just how much more relevant the buried issue of racism would be in July of 2020. So thank you, Shirley Kaiser. I will always trust your intuitions. Karen Naifeh is an analyst member of the C.G.Jung Institute of San Francisco, where she teaches in the internship and analytic training programs and is a co-chair of the Committee of Diversity and Inclusivity. She is on the supervising faculty at the Women's Therapy Center in Berkeley, California. She holds a doctorate in medical physiology as well as clinical psychology, and was adjunct assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of California in San Francisco for 11 years, where she did research in areas of sleep, meditation, and biofeedback. Her areas of special interest are trauma, the shadow, and cultural diversity. Please give a warm welcome to Karen Naifeh.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. And what a time we're in. So I'm going to launch right into my topic, which is encountering the other, the white shadow. And I want to start by telling you about my own experiences of waking up to my own white shadow. I joined the supervisory faculty at the Women's Therapy Center in Berkeley in 2011. It's a relational, psychodynamic, social justice-oriented internship program. And that's where I began to confront more systematically my own more unconscious racial microaggressive beliefs and actions, and to become more fully aware of my white privilege and white fragility. The programs there had a lot of workshops on these topics, and it really forced me to take a look that I had never done before, even though I had periods in my life where racial issues were relevant. And I found that the more I could stay with my discomfort and shame and fear, the freer I felt. I became more open to hearing people of color talk about their experiences. I could really let it sink in. I could tolerate hearing their truth. And the result was an expansion of my sense of well-being and peace. My greater openness to the suffering of other groups due to white privilege and institutional oppression, and my awareness of the negative impact of these forces, even on white people, are really the impetus for my writings and for this program today. So I really believe that Jungian psychology can offer a way to move forward a process of increasing white resilience, and thereby helping to make inroads into this entrenched societal racism that we've been suffering from for a very long time. Fanny Brewster, an African-American Jungian analyst, in her new book, African Americans and Jungian Psychology, Leaving the Shadows, named shadow phenomena at work in maintaining racial bias in the United States. She also discusses Jung's cultural shadow as it manifested in his writings about Africans and African Americans, and the impact of that on us as analytical psychologists. She said, Jung's failure to deepen his theoretical conversation regarding race, culture, and conscious awareness in these areas has left the practice of American Jungian psychology regarding African Americans and race without direction. So in spite of Jung's encounter with the spirit of the depths that he described in the Red Book and his reverence for other cultures, he remained very much a man held by the spirit of the times in which he lived. Eurocentrism, unconscious patronizing racism is evident in Jung's writings. As seen in his many comments about African cultures, people of African heritage, and, quote, primitives, unquote, in general. From our perspective in the 21st century, we can see Jung's unconscious bias, whereas he seemed blind to it. But today, I'm focused on the impact of the spirit of the times on us. We who identify as white unconsciously express attitudes, writings, and actions that are offensive to the other. There are embedded forms of racism and thereby oppression that members of the dominant group learn very early not to see, to keep in the shadows. And here's an example. This was filmed recently 2 doors down from the Jung Institute on Gough Street. And what you're going to see is a white couple being filmed, and you don't see the person making the video, but he's an African-American man who is putting a Black Lives Matter sign on a short retaining wall in front of a house there on Gough Street. And they start the conversation with him saying, "Is this your property?" I hope you can hear their conversation well enough, and I can go over it afterwards if you can't, but basically they are telling him that he is defacing private property. So here we go.
Is this your property? Hi, I'm asking you if this is your property.
Why are you asking?
Because it's private property.
Because it's private property,
So,
sir.
are you defacing private property, or is this your building? You're free to express your opinions, but not on people's property.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Just respectfully.
Sure.
So we're just saying, absolutely, your signs and everything, and that's good. This is not the way to do it.
Okay.
It's private property.
But if I did live here and it was my property, this would be absolutely fine.
Totally.
And you don't know if I live here or if this is my property.
We actually do know. That's why we're asking.
Oh, really? Because you live here, right? You said so.
Because we know the person who does live here.
Oh, okay.
So
Then I suggest you call him or call the police. Or
call the police.
because you're accusing me of a crime, correct?
What I'm asking you is why are you...
And I'm not answering you.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
So your choices are to call the cops if you believe I'm calling a crime, and I will more than be happy to talk to him.
Okay, thank you.
What's your name again?
I'm Lisa.
Lisa, what's your last name?
What is your name?
What's your name? I asked first, Lisa. What's your name, sir?
Robert.
What's your last name, sir?
What is your first name, sir?
I'm not answering. I'm not talking to you. You're talking to me. I'm asking you the questions.
Well, we're not doing anything illegal.
Neither am I.
Actually,
you are actually.
Really? Oh, okay. Well, then call the cops.
Thank you. We will do.
Lisa and Robert.
Yeah.
I'll be right here.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Bye. And that, people, is why Black Lives Matter. That's Karen, and she's calling the cops. And this is going to be really funny. Because she knows the people who live here. Personally.
So actually, he's the person who lives there. But these white people can't get their minds around the fact that a Black man would own that house in Pacific Heights. And nowhere, even though he kind of gives them a hint that maybe he does live there and own the property, they can't get their minds around it. They're convinced that he is defacing someone else's property. So, what forces keep unconscious racial bias alive and active in our societies? One answer lies in a culture's shadow and the polarizations along the lines of culture and race that have existed since our country's founding, that have contributed to the cultural unconscious white people harbor in their shadow. A central tenet of bringing culture's shadow into consciousness is understanding the creation and maintenance of the sense of other in the psyche. Robin DiAngelo, a white American psychologist working to increase awareness of white privilege, writes, "White people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. This insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress. Whites have not had to build the cognitive or affective skills or develop the stamina that would allow for constructive engagement across racial divides." And here is an example from her article and from her book, White Fragility. And I'm quoting, "I am a white woman. I am standing beside a Black woman. We are facing a group of white people who are seated in front of us. We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that whites hold social and institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fist on the table. His face is red and he is furious. As he pounds, he yells, 'White people have been discriminated against for 25 years. I look around the room and see 40 employed people, all white. There are no people of color in this workplace. I am feeling unnerved by this man's disconnection with that reality and his lack of sensitivity to the impact this is having on my co-facilitator, the only person of color in the room. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? We have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism.'" So something about white people's reaction to what DiAngelo calls race-based stress seems to evoke a much larger reaction than an individual's response to confronting his own shadow. In the invitation to put ourselves in the shoes of people of color, white people may begin to apprehend the dark forces that hold racism in place. These dark forces form a part of what I think of as cultural shadow, what each culture acts out, but would find unacceptable, even evil, if examined in the light of day. This is something that Katie Waldman quoted from DiAngelo in her June 20th, 2020 New Yorker article. She said, quoting DiAngelo, "Whites profit off of an American political and economic system that showers advantages on racial winners and oppresses racial losers. Yet white people cling to racial innocence, a form of weaponized denial that positions Black people as the havers of race. Whiteness, on the other hand, scans as invisible, default, a form of racelessness." And here are some of the underlying beliefs. These are the things that we are conscious of, but there's that white privilege and white superiority that's in the shadows. And I've highlighted 3 of them that I think are especially important to look at. As a white person, I will be the judge of whether racism has occurred. In other words, I know it better than the people being oppressed. If I am a good person, I cannot be a racist. And if I can't see it, it isn't legitimate. So all of this, again, is I am the one who really knows, and the person of color is not. I propose that if we can begin to recognize that the source of our discomfort lies in our cultural shadows, and understand that, as in the work on the personal shadow, staying present and engaged while doing our best to tolerate the discomfort will move us closer to wholeness as individuals and as a nation. Okay. So The slide I skipped by, I will have to read. As Jung pointed out, without attention of the opposites, no forward movement is possible. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. And he goes on to say, what comes after the door is, surprisingly enough, a boundless expanse full of unprecedented uncertainty. So the opposites here are what we are conscious of as white people and what we keep in our white shadows. We who identify as white need to go through that tight passage Jung describes to the expanse awaiting us when we can incorporate our white shadow into consciousness. Then we will be able to invoke a generous temenos that welcomes culturally difficult, emotionally charged material and begin a true dialogue with the racial other. Jung pointed out the personal shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. And he also said, and see if this is going to work. Yes, this confrontation is the first test of courage of the inner way. For the meeting with ourselves can be avoided so long as we can project everything negative into the environment. And that's what we're doing in general as white people. We're projecting everything negative onto people of color. Perhaps humans never get to the point where confronting their own personal shadow does not require considerable moral effort. But culture's shadow is more unconscious and therefore much harder to grapple with. Thus, we are even more likely to project cultural shadow into the environment, as the white man in D'Angelo's example does. Now, in Jung's diagram of the geology of the unconscious in his Analytical Psychology lectures of 1925, he places clans and everything below that under the waters of the unconscious. And you can see from the diagram, A is the individual, B is family, C is clans, and you see the waters of the unconscious there covering up clans, then nations, then large groups like European man. So each layer is farther from consciousness. Each layer is more unconscious and therefore much harder to grapple with. So each layer represents groups that hold sway in the life of an individual. Each group has a culture unique to itself, and each culture has a specific and characteristic psychology. So these lower levels in Jung's geology of the unconscious have only recently begun to receive attention. Our current understanding of the relationships between, say, personal, cultural, and archetypal shadow in the unconscious is really quite vague. And today I'm not attempting to provide answers to any of that, but rather to open up discussion and exploration of these various layers of shadow. I think we can say that every layer has an archetypal aspect. For example, the mother and father archetypes in the family layer. I propose that through cultural shadow, archetypal shadow can take hold of the ego collectively. So it would be a cultural manifestation of archetypal shadow, resulting in atrocities with which we are all familiar. The atrocities committed during the Holocaust, for example, while led by Hitler, were a cultural phenomenon. Something quite powerful and transpersonal took over the German people, something in their cultural shadow. The atrocities towards African Americans during and after slavery in the United States up to the present is another example. Ordinary, otherwise, quote, good, unquote, people collectively participated and participate in evil acts towards those they view as others. Now, although Jung did not go into any detail about the influence of each stratum or layer on the development of the personality, post-Jungian writers, Thomas Singer and Samuel Kimbles, and then Singer and Kimbles separately, have continued to focus on specific aspects of these lower layers, which they call cultural complexes. And they said in their book, The Cultural Complex, cultural complexes arise out of the cultural unconscious as it interacts with both archetypal and personal realms of the psyche and the broader outer world arena of schools, communities, ethnic groups, nations, religions, etc. Their contention is that in addition to our personal shadow aspects, we all have cultural shadow aspects. Their descriptions of cultural complexes include the following. A cultural complex expresses itself in powerful moods and repetitive behaviors, both in a group as a whole and in its individual members. A cultural complex resists our most heroic efforts at consciousness. A cultural complex accumulates experiences that validate its point of view and creates a storehouse of self-affirming ancestral memories. Cultural complexes function in an autonomous fashion and affirm a simplistic point of view with fixed, often self-righteous attitudes to the world. And cultural complexes have archetypal cores, making them very hard to resist, reflect upon, and discriminate. They take us over. So let's move on to Jung's cultural complex. We can see it at work in a dream he talks about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and this is the dream. An American Negro. In the dream, he was holding a tremendous red-hot curling iron to my head, intending to make my hair kinky, that is, to give me Negro hair. I could already feel the painful heat and awoke with a sense of terror. I took this dream as a warning from the unconscious. It was saying that the primitive was a danger to me. Jung went on to say, the only thing I could conclude from this was that my European personality must under all circumstances be preserved intact. And I want to underline that Jung could not come up with any other interpretation of his dream than that. That's the spirit of the times at work. He went on, it became clear to me that the trip to Africa, which he was on at the time, had been not so much an objective scientific project as an intensely personal one, and that any attempt to go deeper into it touched every possible sore spot in my own psychology. I believe that Jung is saying that for him, the threat of losing his identity as a white European was so intolerable to his ego that he refused to go further. His interpretation about the, quote, primitive, unquote, being dangerous to him was actually, in my view, a sign that he, as a European man, was not able to withdraw his projection of the primitiveness and inferiority of his own cultural shadow from the Black man, who was indeed not a primitive. The fact that the man in the dream was African American might also reflect Jung's discomfort with being around Americans whom he belittled in several of his writings for taking on, quote, Negro, unquote, characteristics. The African American man in his dream was going to give him a, quote, Negro, unquote, characteristic as well. And Jung resisted exploring what this shadow aspect might uncover in his psyche, fearing it might expose a threat to his European personality. And so here we see how much stronger culture shadow is than individual shadow. Jung simply could not face it. If we look at the dream, the threat does not appear to be to his life, but to his hair, to give him the hair of an African. So if we take hair as power, then Jung may fear having his power taken away. The curling iron is gigantic and red hot, phallic. The barber wants him to experience being, quote, Negro, unquote, and Jung cannot tolerate and be curious about what that would be like because it feels far too dangerous to him. In his reaction, we could postulate the presence of the archetypal other, perceived as able to totally obliterate one's own sense of self. And that moves me to contemplating a master-slave archetype. So self and other, or belongingness and otherness, has existed throughout human history and likely long before humans evolved. I propose that it is an archetypal pattern, and that likewise master-slave is an archetypal pattern. The master-slave archetype is an issue of power. There is always a rationalization for assuming one group or person is superior to another, and that the superior group, therefore, has the right to oppress the inferior group. After all, the colonization of people of color throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas was justified based on the rationalization by Europeans seeking power through conquest, that these were inferior groups that needed civilizing and conversion to Christianity. So this goes back at least as far as Aristotle. This is from 230 BCE, where he wrote, "Is there anyone thus intended by nature to be a slave, and for whom such a condition is expedient and right? Or rather, is not all slavery a violation of nature?" And he went on to say, "There is no difficulty in answering this question on grounds both of reason and of fact. For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule." Now, in spite of Aristotle's conclusion, we can see that from very early times there also existed the idea of slavery as an evil, a violation of nature. And I also want to point out that there's a way that there's something not differentiated in Aristotle here. He is overlapping subjection and rule, or leadership, someone leading and someone following, someone giving orders and someone taking orders, with subjection or oppression. And those two need to be separated. One can be respectful towards one that follow one, that one is a leader of, but that is not being differentiated out in Aristotle. Now, by the 19th century, the German philosopher Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, that was 1807, wrote of the dialectic of the master and slave. And he essentially said that although one needs the recognition of the other for consciousness of self to exist, one must dominate the other to avoid the threat of being annihilated by the other. So essentially, Hegel is saying that we humans need someone else to recognize our existence in order for us to be conscious of ourselves in a way that other mammals are not, but that we need to dominate that other person or they might annihilate us. However, in that stance, Hegel said, is the dependence of the self on the other, which eventually evolves into a reversal of roles. Now, this is likely what's driving the anti-Blackness that Kehana Mariah Ross, who is a professor of African American studies, talks about in her opinion piece in the June 4th, 2020 New York Times, where she said, "Anti-Blackness describes the inability to recognize Black humanity. The violence we experience isn't tied to any particular transgression. It's gratuitous and unrelenting. For white people, again better described as those who have been racialized white, Black people are at once despised and also a useful counterpoint for others to measure their humanness against. The thingification of Black people is a fundamental component of the identity of this nation. Now back to Hegel. Hegel also held that slavery belongs to a necessary stage of history, and it has to be replaced by legal relations between persons, between equal persons, and that the abolition of slavery is accomplished as a result of the progress of reason and the consciousness of freedom. So I want you to remember back to what Aristotle said, that reason told us that slavery was okay. So we need some progress of reason here. Now, Jessica Benjamin, a white psychoanalyst, has viewed this notion of master and slave through a psychoanalytic lens in terms of the nature of relationship between the sexes in her book, Bonds of Love, where she talks about the relational paradigm of domination, submission, versus the paradigm of mutuality. And she writes, domination and submission result from a breakdown of the necessary tension between self-assertion and mutual recognition that allows self and other to meet as sovereign equals. So in Jungian terms, what she's saying is that we need a tension of the opposites. And the opposites here are self-assertion and mutual recognition. And in holding that tension, the transcendent function can operate so that something new can be born, sovereign equals. Throughout human history, the dominant paradigm could be said to be domination, submission. Slavery in ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, Russia, the caste system in India, feudal lords and serfs in Europe, and colonization throughout Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Australia, for example. The idea that some human beings were meant to serve meant they were the chattel of others, and that was a constant. That began to change in the West in the 18th century as revolution began to foment in Europe and the American colonies. The idea that all people had certain inalienable rights, and even the equality of all men, and I do say men, began to take hold. So let's look at the formation of the American white cultural complex. Because the question is, how then did the newly formed United States of America, founded on the principle that all men are created equal, justify slavery? An unconscious process of splitting and dissociating had to occur. The story we tell is the second episode in the documentary Race, the Power of an Illusion, and it demonstrates the ways in which, early in its history as a nation, those in power in the United States created a story that racial differences existed and that the white race was superior to all others, especially the Black race, which was not even quite human. That was the story. The story of race was created to keep in the shadows the political and economic rationale for oppression in a country whose founding principle was equality of all men.
For the first 50 years in the American colonies, most of the laborers were European indentured servants, many toiling on tobacco plantations in wretched conditions. With fewer Europeans braving the treacherous journey across the Atlantic, planters facing a potential labor shortage turned to the transatlantic slave trade and gradually replaced indentured servants with African slaves. Colony by colony, new laws made slavery permanent and inheritable for Black people, and for the first time the word white, rather than Christian or Englishman, began appearing in colonial statutes. As African slavery increased, lower-class Europeans won new rights and opportunities. Some even became overseers and bounty hunters responsible for policing the growing slave population.
The ordinary white people are not going to be complicit in this system unless they get something out of it. My belief is that payoff was in a certain status, prestige, recognition, ego enhancement that ordinary white people could derive from racism. And so there was a kind of bargain struck.
Many of the European-descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery.
In the documentary, the case is made that wealthy Americans use the story of race to push moral implications of the enslavement of Africans into the shadows of the unconscious so that they could have a ready workforce, a free workforce, and see themselves as good men who cherished the ideal of equality. Working class European Americans, who were the existing inferior class, gained in prestige and power, and now had a scapegoat upon which to project their own feelings of inferiority. The impact on the psyches of those who perpetrated this and those who went along with it was to create a closed system that Singer and Kimbles have aptly called a cultural complex. Then, as in all complexes, this cultural complex proceeded to enlarge and strengthen itself against the growing objections to the institution of slavery. And the greater the evils of slavery that were perpetrated, the more white people needed to push their own evil actions into the shadows and to project them onto those they subjugated. In her recent book, The Origin of Others, Toni Morrison remarks, "The necessity of rendering the slave a foreign species appears to be a desperate attempt to confirm one's own white self as normal. The danger of sympathizing with the other is the possibility of becoming an other. To lose one's racialized rank is to lose one's own valued and enshrined difference." And I think this is really important because this is part of what we white people get intimidated by. Because the first reaction, if you say something to a white person who is being overtly racist, at least in the past, was, "Oh, you're just a nigger lover." You know, there's something really awful where you begin to be attacked and you begin to be put in that same category so that you're at risk of losing your own racialized rank and of having violence done to you. So there's an issue there. But key here is the meaning that is made of difference.
Race was never just a matter of how you look. It's about how people assign meaning to how you look.
So from the founding of our country to the present, there has been a mandate in the unconscious of European Americans as a culture created by the American white cultural complex to assign meaning to African Americans and themselves. Dark skin means inferiority. White skin means superiority.
After President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, his administration consulted Louis Agassiz on how to deal with the newly freed black population. Agassiz advised, "Beware of how we give to the blacks rights by virtue of which they may endanger the progress of whites. They are incapable of living on a footing of social equality."
If America had just looked the world in the eye and said, "We hold these people in slavery because we need their labor, and we've got the power to do it." Now that would have been much better, because then when the power was gone, when slavery is over, it's over. But what we said was, there's something about these people. By doing that, it means that when slavery is over, that rationalization for slavery remains.
popular magazines contribute to an emerging sense of what is and what isn't American, who's white, who's not, who's better, who's worse. The unifying principle is a principle of white supremacy. It's a principle of shared racial identity. And if you are white, or if you can be made to identify with whiteness, you are going to be considered to be in. And that line of whiteness cuts across class lines and provides a way to unify Americans on the basis of race.
All through the late 19th century, there is this constant message hammered at poor white people. You may be poor. You may have miserable lives right now. But the thing that's most important, the thing we want you to focus on, is the fact that you're white.
And that still goes on today. That's part of the alliance between the very wealthy and the white working class poor. As the documentary also demonstrates, the misinformation that supported viewing African Americans as inferior, dangerous, and so on only increased with emancipation. The Jim Crow laws that came into being reinforced the idea of the inferiority and also dangerousness of African Americans and justified the horrendous acts that were perpetrated: beatings, torture, rape, murder, lynching of Black people, all occurred in the South with no repercussions. African Americans were still in bondage, still deprived of equal treatment, equal opportunity, and the vote by the threat of these kinds of violence. Such conditions were the prime motivation for the tremendous migration of African Americans out of the South and into northern cities from 1915 until after the Civil Rights Movement. So even when emancipation came at the end of the US Civil War, the relational paradigm, the cultural complexes, and therefore the rationalization for, quote, slavery, unquote, now expressed as racism, remained. For people who had come to recognize themselves as superior simply because they were white, and who had treated their slaves in ways they would have to recognize as oppressive and evil if they viewed the former slaves as equal to themselves, the shock of the reality that they were not superior and that they had perpetrated heinous crimes would be unbearable. Such realizations would have to be repressed and rationalized at all costs, pushed far into the shadows. The brief glimpse of evil would have redoubled the need to project it onto the subjugated, to dispel the knowledge of their own evil. I don't think it ever got to consciousness for most of them. Further, one could say that within the archetypal paradigm of master-slave, letting go of the stance of master evokes the primitive archetypal terror of the threat of annihilation by the other.
Birth of a Nation was just a profoundly important cultural event.
It's the first major blockbuster film, hailed for both its artistic achievement and for its political commentary.
And when it was released, it had this rapturous response. There were lines, everywhere that it was being shown.
Birth of a Nation confirmed the story that many whites wanted to tell about the Civil War and its aftermath.
What we overlook about Birth of a Nation was that it was also a tremendously accurate prediction of the way in which race would operate in the United States. Birth of a Nation was almost directly responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. It had received this romantic, glowing, heroic portrait.
The ripples emanate far out from just the simple fact that it's a movie in the early motion picture age.
With the tremendous burst of popularity that the Ku Klux Klan had as a result of Birth of a Nation came another wave of terrorism.
what holds this paradigm in place? Well, Fanny Brewster has pointed out that culture shapes consciousness. It begins at an early age from initial child rearing practices and develops later through other experiences, so that cultural consciousness permeates every aspect of life. And because of that, we are all permeated with it because it started in on us from the time we were infants. Now, I won't get into an exploration of the origins and adaptive power of identification with the group, but I think it's clear that the power of the culture one grows up in and identifies with is exponentially more powerful than that of the individual. The need to belong to a group is an extremely potent and primal force, ensuring survival. So people are much more likely to go along with dominating, aggressive, or self-serving actions if they are sanctified by the group they belong to, especially if that's all one has ever known. And especially since going against the culture's belief system would almost always lead to expulsion, shaming, possibly even violence to the person doing so. Any moral conflict about going along with or perpetrating evil acts is therefore banned to the unconscious. One grows up within a culture, and that culture, including its complexes, is essentially mother's milk. And I think this is why Robin DiAngelo really reinforces that we are all racists. If you identify as white, if your culture identifies you as white, you are a racist because you are embedded in that system. And so the job is just to become more and more aware of that. And here we see someone being inculcated in. So here we are with The Help, written by Catherine Stockett. And in this film, one can see these forces at work. The film is actually more sanitized than the book, but still one can see some of these forces at work and how the cultural complexes are maintained. There's a lot of intimidation and shaming, the threat of humiliation, ostracism, and even violence towards the main white character. And certainly the advantages that come from staying within the white culture's complex, which all operate to keep racism firmly entrenched. Now, in both the book and the film, the tremendous danger posed to the Black maids who dare to tell their stories and the complete ostracism of the white woman who orchestrates the project are pretty chilling to witness. The maids suffer the threat of loss of jobs and being blackballed, loss of husbands' jobs, violence, and incarceration. There is one incident of incarceration where one of the maids gets a charge trumped up against her and gets put in jail. So let's take a look at one of the clips.
We never finished our conversation at Elizabeth's. About that book I want to write? I'd really like to interview you, Aibileen. I know it's scary.
They set my cousin Chanel's car on fire just because she went down to the boating station.
A book like this has never been written before.
Because there's a reason. I do this with you, I might as well burn my own house down.
I promise we'll be careful.
This already ain't careful, Miss Skeeter. You're not knowing that's what scared me the most. Scared me more than Jim Crow.
Notice.
Here's my phone number. And my car's here. I could just take you home.
No, ma'am.
Did you notice the white woman who stopped to watch all this and how nervous it made the black maid? Now, the white woman is ejected from her social groups because of her activities. She's shunned and sabotaged by those she thought were friends, and she's rejected by her fiancé when he finds out that she spearheaded the writing of the book.
You told me to write something good, something I believed in.
It's not what I believe in. Now, that joke you pulled with Hilly with the toilets, that's funny. Why would you do this to us? I don't even know why you care.
What?
Things are fine around here. Why go stir up trouble?
Trouble's already here, Stuart. I had to tell you this. You needed to know.
Goddamn right I needed to know. You should have told me this from the start. You're a selfish woman, Skeeter.
Stuart.
I think you're better off being alone.
But the other theme in the film is the courage that the maids demonstrate in telling their stories and having them published in the face of cultural complexes whose role is to keep them voiceless. And there is vital for we who identify as white to see the fear, ostracism, and pain that the central white character must confront and tolerate in order not to be devoured by the white cultural complex herself. Now, the situation in the South is more extreme and therefore more clear-cut, making it easier to see the cultural complexes at work. But we all suffer from the cultural complex of white superiority. Isabel Wilkerson, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, chronicles the exodus of almost 6 million African Americans over 5.5 decades. It is clear from her book that the problems the Blacks faced in the North, although very different from the problems in the South, had their origins in the pervasive idea, which came from the weaving of the stories of race, of the inferiority of African Americans and the superiority of white Americans, which had invaded the psyches of everyone in America. I quote her, "Blacks in North America could already vote and sit in a lunch counter or anywhere they wanted on an elevated train, yet they were hemmed in and isolated into 2 overcrowded sections of Chicago, restricted in the jobs they could hold and the mortgages they could get, their children attending segregated and inferior schools, not by edict as in the South, but by circumstance in the North, with the results pretty much the same. The unequal living conditions produce the expected unequal results. Blacks working long hours for overpriced flats, their children left unsupervised and open to gangs, with the resulting rise in crime and drugs, with few people able to get out, and the problem so complex as to make it impossible to identify a single cause or solution. So to summarize, 3 things I believe have kept and continue to keep unconscious racial bias alive and active in our societies are as follows. 1 is the deep unconsciousness of cultural complexes formed by means of beliefs we are taught about the cultural other by our parents and communities' child-rearing practices early in our lives. 2nd is the fear of the emotional impact of becoming conscious of our own collusion in racial bias, because in our cultural shadow linger remnants of archetypal shadow. And we feel that evil coming forth when we face all this because of the generational trauma. And 3rd, unwillingness to become conscious of and take back our own cultural and personal shadow material that we have projected onto people of color. To me, there's 2 imperatives supporting our doing the hard work of letting go of racial bias and thereby emerging from this white cultural complex. One is the self-evident moral imperative due to the suffering it perpetrates on people of color. But the other is that it harms white people as well. I believe it's important for white people to become more conscious of the negative impact on themselves of the trauma of slavery and the legacy of slavery. Then we can begin to comprehend the immense harm to ourselves that is caused by keeping the institutional racial bias alive and active that is still going on today. So now I'm going to go to screen share. Okay, everybody see that? In the mid-19th century, Harriet Jacobs, in her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, writes, "I can testify from my own experience and observation that slavery is a curse to the whites as well as to the blacks. It makes the white fathers cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious. It contaminates the daughters and makes the wives wretched." In spite of the strenuousness with which white culture keeps racism and oppression in place, the cost to society is enormous. In an article titled "Justice Delayed" in the August 22nd, 2016 issue of The New Yorker, Brian Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, is quoted as follows: "I continue to believe that we're not free in this country, that we're not free at birth by a history of racial injustice. There are spaces that are occupied by the legacy of that history that weigh on us. We talk a lot about freedom. We talk a lot about equality. We talk a lot about justice, but we're not free. There are shadows that follow us." Now, all this applies to white people as well. We're not free either, and there are shadows that follow us. Phantom narratives, to use Sam Kimball's phrase, that live in white culture's shadows and haunt us. Now, here's an example from The Help. Skeeter, who is this main character, she's come home after graduating from college, and she's been asking what happened to her beloved nanny, Constantine, who was really the mother figure for her and whom she loved dearly. And Constantine has disappeared, and her mother keeps evading telling her what's happened. And finally, in this scene, she does. And she's talking about a big party she had at the house where she was inducted as a regent into the Daughters of the Revolution or something like that, and how proud she was.
Regent Grace Higginbotham, our esteemed president, came all the way down from Washington, D.C. to our house for the ceremony. It's just beautiful. Look at that. All this way.
I haven't met her not for the last 20 years.
Hello, Miss Charlotte.
Rachel. We were expecting you next week.
I decided to come early and surprise Mama.
I'm entertaining. Why don't you go around back, wait in the kitchen? Go on now. Sorry. Rachel, what are you doing?
Well, I'm just doing as I was told, Miss Charlotte. Going to the kitchen. But I'm going to see my mama first.
Watch her expression.
Hello, Mama.
Go on to the kitchen, Katie. I'll be there directly. You may put up with this kind of nonsense, but I do not.
Get out of this house, Rachel.
You heard her. Go on, girl. Miss Charlotte, let me take her to the kitchen. Come on, baby. Let's go. Charlotte.
Both of you. Leave. Now.
Come on, Mama.
Come on now.
How could you not tell me all this? Because I didn't want to upset you during your final exams. And I knew you'd blame me, and it wasn't my fault.
I have to go find her. She needs me.
Eugenia.
What?
We sent your brother up to Chicago to bring Constantine home. When he got there, she died.
So you could see the woman was fighting her white complex. She didn't want to do that, but she felt constrained to stay within it because she was being shamed in front of all those women. And it was so important to her to belong to that group. And here is the harm done to her daughter. Now, as Toni Morrison writes in her novel, Beloved,
white people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle, swift, unnavigable waters, swinging, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet white blood. In a way, he thought, they were right. The more colored people spent their strength trying to convince them how gentle they were, how clever and loving, how human, the more they used themselves up to persuade whites of something Negroes believed could not be questioned, the deeper and more tangled the jungle grew inside. But it wasn't the jungle blacks brought with them to this place from the other livable place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them. And it grew. It spread. In, through, and after life, it spread until it invaded the whites who had made it, touched them, everyone, changed and altered them, made them bloody, silly, worse than even they wanted to be, so scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own.
So here is an immensely powerful depiction of the creation of cultural complexes and the projection of cultural shadow, with the consequent negative repercussions to Black people and white people. Singer and Kimbles in The Cultural Complex note that failure to consider cultural complexes as part of the work of individuation puts a tremendous burden on both the personal and archetypal realms of the psyche, and does not allow for the freeing up of the tremendous energy held in the grip of the cultural complexes. So, repairing. Janice Gump, an African-American psychoanalyst, writes in Psychoanalytic Psychology, Institutional slavery in the United States, which lasted for centuries, has been denied to the extent that its affective and traumatic aspects remain widely undiscussed and unknown to many. And she also points out that trauma leaves a void that can be filled only by the revisiting of it. If white people can begin to revisit some of the trauma as well, in the context of searching for a way to achieve some healing for whites as well as people of color, we may come closer to filling that void. I think we're not aware as white people of just how harmed we are and how much healing we need. Jessica Benjamin points out that the reciprocal relationship between self and other can be compared with the optical illusion in which the figure and ground are constantly changing their relation, even as their outlines remain clearly distinct, as in Escher's birds, which appear to fly in both directions. The difficulty, she says, is that we are asked to look in both directions simultaneously. I believe it is also a matter of moral courage in facing the harm done by the master to the slave and the inevitable deflation of giving up one's sense of superiority vis-a-vis the other. Deflation might feel like annihilation, but it is actually the blow to the supremacy of the ego that allows for the opening up of consciousness necessary for psychological growth. So we who are identified as white must do what Jung could not do: tolerate becoming conscious of the qualities we project onto people of color that are in our own shadow, and tolerate the shame we will feel if we allow ourselves to see how we as individuals and as a society continue to support institutions of oppression, so that healing of this trauma can happen for everyone concerned. And let's see if I can stop the screen share. Okay. So here's some examples of repairing. As soon as I can get them up, I have to move some things around to access. Okay. Well, actually, I wanted to share from Slaves in the Family. This is the book by Edward Ball, and because I took away screen sharing, I'm not going to be able to share the slide, but here's the book. And he published it in 1998. It was a New York Times bestseller and got the National Book Award. And he comes from a very, very long line of slave-owning plantation families that going all the way back to the 1600s. So this has been in the Ball family for all these generations. And he went on a journey to find his Black kin, going back to records he had that he inherited from his forebears, and using that to trace people. It's really quite a remarkable book because he went all over the country. And in the process of doing this and finding these people, he brought them history that they didn't have access to because records weren't kept on slaves. So I want to read you a little bit from this book. This is one of the first families that he found. And it's a Black family. Let's see. And the Black woman is talking, Caroline. She says, and Frederick Poyas, my grandmother said that his father was white. Did she ever say who that might have been, I asked. That's Edward Ball talking. No, but from what my grandmother said about the Balls, they must have been. Their masters must have been the Balls. B came back. It sounded like an answer to a slightly different question until B finished the thought. The Balls had allowed Frederick Poyas to buy a piece of property from them, and my grandmother seemed to think that he might have been the son of one of them, one of the Balls. So they go on with this discussion, and then I want to read you toward the end of it. There was a silence in the room, and I thought I heard the humming of the refrigerator. I felt a pack of emotions and was not sure which to single out and hold. Part of the touching fact of our getting to know each other, I said, grasping for words, is the possibility that you and I are distantly related. Carolyn nodded, and so did B. There was a feeling of roominess around the table, as though we had walked into a clearing from the woods. We talked some more until eventually Carolyn picked the right emotion and laid it out. The only thing that can cure what's happened, she said, is for us to administer love. So that's slaves in the family. I also want to go to something from that one of the members of the Analysis and Activism listserv shared with the group in June of 2020. This was, she's in the UK, and this was after some parts of the UK started taking down statues of some of the slave owners. She said, my ancestors have 7 generations of history of plantation slave owning in Barbados. You will not find my surname in any register of Barbadian plantation owners or families who were compensated for the loss of income after the abolition of slavery. I can hide from our place in this history. I can rage at the badness of George Colston. He was one of the statues that was taken down. I could pretend it was not my family, like most of the UK has pretended. And like many of us, it is my family. Collectively, it was our families. So as much as I can feel glad that these statues were taken down and might be relocated and recontextualized, and the full history of those 200 years be brought into the light, I think and feel about my personal heritage of people who stopped other people breathing, and what Ben Okri describes as their failure of humanity, both wanting to hide and knowing that that reduces me to another failure of humanity. In this process of owning up, I take courage and heart from Fanny Brewster's idea of a circle of care, how to find that in myself, with my ancestors, and then in the world. And this is from Michelle Alexander's New York Times opinion piece on June 8th of 2020. We must face our racial history and our racial present. We cannot solve a problem we do not understand. Donald Trump would not be the president, and George Floyd would not be dead if after the Civil War, our nation had committed itself to reparations, reconciliation, and atonement for the land and people that colonizers stole, sold, and plundered. Instead, white people who enslaved blacks were granted reparations for the loss of their, quote, property, unquote, while formerly enslaved blacks were given nothing, not even the 40 acres and a mule they were promised. Ever since, our nation has been trapped in a cycle of intermittent racial progress, followed by fierce backlash and the emergence of new and, quote, improved, unquote, systems of racial and social control. These cycles have been punctuated by various movements, uprisings, and riots, but one thing has remained constant: a majority of whites persistently deny the scale and severity of racial injustice that people of color endure. It's not enough to learn the broad outlines of this history. Only by pausing long enough to study the cycles of oppression and resistance does it become clear that simply being a good person or not wishing Black people any harm is not sufficient, nor is voting for Democrats or diversifying police forces. In fact, those efforts have not made much of a dent in ending abusive policing or mass incarceration. So now I want to go back to something that I have in my article. That is from the Psychotherapy Institute, which is a clinical training organization in Berkeley and is intensely involved in the work of dismantling white privilege and white fragility. In their newsletter Viewpoint from the January-February 2018 issue are several responses of participants at their fall symposium confronting white fragility, which was led by Robin DiAngelo. Responses of the participants show the deflation of white entitlement and the building of white resilience at work. And one of the responses was especially notable, and I'm going to quote it. Relief, then warm wash of shame, gratitude, glint of hope. As I sit in the audience as Robin DiAngelo speaks, I am by turns excited and nauseated. The energy in the room feels crackling, fertile, palpable, alive. This woman knows the shape of it, the shape of us, our diagnosis, our white liberal syndrome, our grouped pattern behavior. This is the shape of my white awkwardness, my white avoidance, my white collusion, my white unskillfulness, my white defense. For example, I can hold my individual white home purchase as an incredible gift, but holding it in isolation spares me the discomfort, DiAngelo offered, moral trauma of seeing it as part of a large whitening of my former mostly Black neighborhood. This truth is incongruent with my self-concept as a good moral being. This fierce white woman modeled using her capacities at full throttle, and I left inspired, my biggest self called upon. What is the full stretch of my white capacity, and what is holding me back from it? And now I want to turn finally to the New York Times Magazine of July 5th. There was a long article entitled, "What is Owed?" Quote, "Colossal societal ruptures have been the only things potent enough to birth transformative racial change in this country. And perhaps a viral pandemic colliding with our nation's 400-year racial one has forced that type of rupture today. Maybe it had to be this way. This deep and collective suffering was necessary for white Americans to feel enough of the pain that Black Americans have always known to tilt the scale. If Black lives are truly to matter in America, this nation must move beyond slogans and symbolism. Citizens don't inherit just the glory of their nation, but its wrongs too. A great country does not ignore or excuse its sins. It confronts them and then works to make them right. If we are to be redeemed, if we are to live up to the magnificent ideals upon which we were founded, we must do what is just." So I do have the apology of that CEO guy that yelled ugly racist remarks in the restaurant, and I want to read it just because it's a truer apology than the one that the woman I showed you in the first video gave, which was, "I should have minded my own business." And even though these are only words, it's a start. And I think we have to act from really meaning these kinds of apologies. So I'm going to read it real quick. Quote, I will make it my duty to ensure my personal actions do not continue to have a detrimental impact on those people closest to me. I have once again begun my journey back to sobriety and have enrolled in an anti-racist program with immediate effect. My comments towards families involved were racist, hurtful, and deeply inappropriate. The reactions to what was said have been deserved, and I wholeheartedly acknowledge that I am complicit in a system that enables this behavior and these broken beliefs to exist. But I am dedicated to changing. Now, the reason I'm actually bothering with that is that he's taking ownership. He's not making excuses. He's not saying, I really didn't mean it. That's not really who I am. He is owning it. And I think that's a first step. But actions are the next step. Okay, thank you, everyone. And what I want to do now is have us all break into small groups. And I want us to do a little experiential piece where we talk about, let's see, I had it all written out, but I've lost where I put it. So, but basically I want you all to think about your own racism. When have you gotten caught in a racist act? This is going to be confessional, but confession is good for the soul, and it eases the heavy heart. So if you're brave enough to think about a time when you, not meaning to, but you did say something hurtful, how did it come across? What did you feel? And what did you do? Or if you were ever a bystander in a racist act, how did that feel to you? Did you speak up or did you not? If you did, what was going on for you? If you didn't, what was going on for you? Those sorts of things. If there's something else you want to share, that's fine too. But I want it to be personal. I don't want you talking in the abstract about the ideas that I presented today, but really about your own experience of your own racism. Well, I think we're at time, Steve, so shall we say goodbye to everyone?
Karen, thank you very much. This has just been an amazing talk, and I think we're just so lucky to have you. And
thank you
very much. Yes.
It was a real honor, so thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And
hope to see you all at a Jung Institute event.
Yeah. And I'm so glad to see new faces and old faces. So, and like I say, I will be sending out the information that Karen.
Wonderful.
Oh, I also wanted to say very quickly that I included a letter I wrote to my state legislator because I think it's time for taking action. It's about police brutality. So just to encourage all of you to start taking action about some of the institutional bias and speaking up against police brutality, because things really have to change and we have to be the ones to make them change. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
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 Come again, everyone who's new. Come again.
Thank you.
For sure.
Here.
Bye.